The alarm cut through the chamber before Speaker Cadris even finished his sentence. I was standing at the small podium reserved for human delegates, halfway through explaining why my species deserved a full vote instead of a silent seat in the back row, when the entire wall behind the council table turned red and started flashing. Every conversation in the room stopped at once. 900 delegates from 40 different worlds went quiet, and in that silence I heard my own heartbeat. A voice broke through the translators before anyone in the chamber could speak. It was rough, metallic, and full of contempt. "This is Overlord Vorak of the Dren Ascendancy. Your council has 1 hour to withdraw all personnel from the research outpost you call Haven Ridge. If you do not comply, I will burn it from orbit and use its ashes as a warning to every weak species hiding behind this council's skirts." The feed showed a fleet of dark, jagged ships gathering above a small blue and green world. I recognized it immediately. Haven Ridge was not a military base. It was a science colony, home to 400 researchers, engineers, and their families. My people. I had visited Haven Ridge only once, a year earlier, when I flew home for a short leave and stopped to see an old colleague working on the colony's atmospheric research project. I remembered the wide fields of blue grass, the children playing near the water reclamation towers, the way the whole colony smelled faintly of rain even on clear days. I remembered a young engineer named Daniel Marsh showing me the new solar array his team had just finished installing. So proud of it he could barely stop talking. I wondered if he was still there, if he was watching those same dark ships gather in the sky above his home right now, wondering if anyone in this chamber cared enough to help him. I felt the eyes of the entire chamber turn toward me, not with sympathy, with curiosity, the way you might watch an insect trapped under glass. Speaker Cadris, a tall reptilian elder with pale green scales and a voice like grinding stone, turned slowly in his seat and looked directly at me. "It appears your colony has attracted unwanted attention, Delegate Ellison," he said. "The Ascendancy does not make idle threats. I would suggest you use your hour wisely." I gripped the edge of the podium so hard my knuckles went white. My name is Grace Ellison, and until that moment, I had spent 3 years in this chamber, trying to convince aliens 20 times our age that humanity deserved a seat at their table. Now I had 60 minutes to save 400 people, and the beings who controlled the only council fleet close enough to help were watching me like I was already defeated. I thought of every argument I had ever prepared for a moment like this, every carefully worded appeal to precedent and treaty law, and found that none of it mattered anymore. Precedent would not save Haven Ridge. Only speed would, and speed was the one thing this council had never shown any interest in offering my species. "I request an emergency deployment of council peacekeeping ships to Haven Ridge," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "Under Article 12, any member species under direct threat is entitled to protection." A murmur ran through the chamber, not agreement, laughter, quiet and cruel, hidden behind alien hands and mouth parts. I had heard that laughter before. The first week I arrived in this chamber, when I asked for a translator that could handle human idioms properly. I had heard it again when I requested a larger delegation office, and again when I asked for a seat closer to the central table instead of the narrow bench pushed against the back wall. Each time, I had told myself it did not matter, that patience was part of the job, that eventually they would learn to take us seriously. Standing there with a countdown clock ticking above my head, I understood for the first time just how much that patience had cost us. The Vantar delegate, a thin blue-skinned diplomat named Solon who had always been polite to me in private, would not meet my eyes now. "Humanity has never contributed a single vessel to Council defense operations," Speaker Cadris said. "You have no fleet on record beyond a handful of survey craft. Why should this council risk its ships for a colony that offers nothing in return?" "Because that's what a council is supposed to do," I said. "Protect its members." "You are not yet a member," he said. "You are an observer. Observers watch. They do not demand." I looked around the chamber for any sign of support and found none. The Torvani cluster, who usually voted alongside the smaller species out of principle, kept their eyes fixed on their own data screens. The insectoid cheer delegation, who had shared a meal with me only 2 days earlier, and told me stories about their homeworld's twin moons, folded their forelimbs and looked away. Even Solon, who I had once considered something close to a friend in this strange and distant place, said nothing to defend me. I understood then that no one in this chamber was going to help us. Whatever happened next, it would have to come from somewhere else entirely. The countdown clock appeared on the main display, ticking down from 58 minutes. I stared at it and felt something cold settle in my chest. The kind of cold that comes right before you stop feeling afraid and start feeling something much more dangerous. I turned away from the podium and pressed the emergency channel on my wrist unit, the one connected directly to Earth Fleet Command. My hands were steady now. Somewhere in that hour, my fear had turned into something else. "This is Delegate Ellison," I said quietly, so only the channel could hear me. "Haven Ridge is under direct threat. Dren Ascendancy Fleet in orbit. 1 hour until they open fire. The Council will not intervene." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to wonder if anyone was even listening. Then a familiar voice answered, calm and unhurried, like he had been expecting this call his entire career. "Copy that, Delegate," said Fleet Commander Oliver Pratt. "We have eyes on Haven Ridge already. Sit tight." "Oliver, they have 12 warships in orbit. What can we possibly send in an hour?" "More than you think," he said, and I could hear the faint sound of orders being given in the background, dozens of voices moving fast and calm at the same time. "Just keep them talking up there. Bias the clock. How many ships are we actually talking about?" "Grace, I need you focused on that chamber, not on numbers you don't need yet. Trust the plan. We built it for exactly this kind of morning." I almost laughed, despite everything. Oliver had a way of making even the worst days sound like routine paperwork. I had known him since flight training, back when neither of us imagined we would end up on opposite sides of the galaxy, him commanding fleets and me arguing with diplomats who thought humanity was barely worth the translator software. "Take care of my people down there, Oliver." "Always do," he said. 49 minutes, Grace. Make them count." The channel went quiet. I turned back to the chamber, where Speaker Cadris was still watching me, with the patient, amused look of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. "Well, Delegate Ellison," he said, "what will you do now that your council has refused you?" I looked at the countdown. 51 minutes. "I'm going to ask you to reconsider," I said. "Because in less than an hour, you're going to watch something happen that no species in this chamber has ever seen, and I would rather you see it as an ally than as a stranger." A few of the delegates actually laughed at that, openly this time. Speaker Cadris did not laugh. Something in my voice must have made him pause, because his eyes narrowed slightly, the way a predator's eyes narrow when it senses something is not quite right about the prey standing in front of it. "You speak with unusual confidence for a species with 340 ships, he said. "I never said we only had 340 ships, I answered. The chamber went still again. I could feel dozens of translators working overtime behind alien ears, replaying my words to make sure they had understood me correctly. On the main display, the countdown reached 45 minutes. Overlord Vorak's fleet held its position above Haven Ridge, dark hulls catching the light of a distant sun, waiting for the moment they believed they had already won. I did not know exactly what Fleet Command was preparing. I only knew what I had been told years ago, in a quiet briefing room back on Earth, by officers who never smiled when they talked about defense. "We do not show our strength until the moment it matters. We do not let anyone count us until counting no longer helps them." I remembered the officer who trained me for this posting, a stern woman named Claire Whitfield, who used to say that every quiet year we spent letting the galaxy underestimate us was a year we spent building something the galaxy had never seen. At the time, I had thought it was simply a way of easing the sting of being dismissed in every meeting, every negotiation, every trade summit. Standing in that chamber with the countdown ticking above my head, I finally understood she had meant it literally. I looked at Speaker Cadris, at the amused blue eyes of Solon, at the rows of delegates who had spent 3 years treating my species like a curious footnote in the history of this galaxy. None of them knew what was coming. None of them could know, because we had spent a decade making absolutely certain of it. 44 minutes, I said. I suggest you keep watching. Somewhere above Haven Ridge, Overlord Vorak's fleet held its position, dark and confident, certain that no one was coming. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I turned my attention back to the countdown, and I waited, the way my grandmother used to say you wait before a storm, when the air goes still and the birds stop singing and you know, somewhere deep in your bones, that everything is about to change. The chamber around me had gone quiet in a different way now, no longer amused, no longer certain. For the first time since I had arrived in that room 3 years earlier, I felt the weight of every alien eye watching me not with curiosity, but with something close to doubt. And doubt, I had learned, was where every real change in this galaxy always began. The clock above the council table continued its steady, merciless count, each passing second a small reminder of everything that still hung in the balance. I thought of Daniel Marsh checking his shield readings one more time, of Claire Whitfield gathering her people close, of Oliver Pratt somewhere far beyond this chamber giving orders I could only imagine. Whatever happened in the next 44 minutes would decide more than the fate of a single colony. It would decide, once and for all, whether this galaxy would ever again mistake our patience for weakness. Daniel Marsh was crouched under a workbench in the main engineering hall when the first warning siren tore through Haven Ridge, and his hands were shaking so badly, he dropped the wrench he had been holding twice before he managed to grip it properly. I was watching the colony's internal camera feed from the chamber, patched through on a private channel Fleet Command had given me, and I could see everything Daniel could see. Families running toward the shelters beneath the residential domes. Children being carried by parents who tried to smile for them even as their own faces were pale with fear. The sky above Haven Ridge, usually a soft blue, now streaked with the reflected light of a dozen enemy warships holding position in low orbit. Haven Ridge had been built 8 years earlier, one of the first true settlements humanity established outside our own solar system. It was never meant to be a fortress. Its founders had chosen the site for its clean water, its mild seasons, and its rich soil, believing that after so many centuries of conflict at home, the greatest thing we could offer the galaxy was proof that we could still build something gentle. 400 people had made their lives there, growing crops in the wide valley fields, raising children who had never once set foot on Earth, teaching them that the stars above their heads were not something to fear but something to explore. Now those same stars held ships built for nothing but destruction, and the gentle world those founders had dreamed of was one order away from being turned to ash. Central. "This is Martian engineering," Daniel said into his comm unit, his voice cracking slightly. "Reactor core is stable. We're at full shield capacity. How long until support arrives?" There was a pause before Chief Administrator Claire Whitfield answered him. I recognized her voice immediately, the same steady, unshakable tone she had used years earlier when she trained me for this posting. "Unknown, Daniel. Keep those shields up and keep our people calm. That's your job right now." I wanted to reach through the screen and tell them both what I knew, that somewhere out past the edge of the system, an entire fleet was already moving, that Oliver Pratt did not make promises he could not keep. But I had no way to send that message, and even if I did, Fleet Command's own protocol forbade it. Surprise was the whole plan. Nobody down there, not even the people whose lives depended on it, could know what was coming until it arrived. The countdown clock on my private display read 38 minutes. Above Haven Ridge, Overlord Forak's flagship drifted forward, a massive black vessel shaped like a blade, its hull marked with deep scars from battles fought across 100 different systems. I had read the intelligence briefings on the Dren Ascendancy before this session. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. Their entire culture was built around the belief that strength alone determined the right to exist, and weakness alone determined the right to be destroyed. "This is your final warning," Forak's voice boomed across every open channel in the system, reaching the colony below as clearly as it had reached the council chamber. "Evacuate now or remain and be erased. I grow tired of waiting for a council that refuses to protect its own children." On the ground, I watched Claire Whitfield's expression change as she listened to the broadcast. It was not fear I saw on her face. It was something closer to fury, the kind of anger that comes from watching a bully threaten people who cannot fight back. "We are not leaving our home," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. Then, louder, into the colony-wide comm, "Everyone to your shelters. Reactor teams, hold your positions. We wait this out together." I felt something tighten in my chest watching her. 400 people, none of them soldiers, none of them trained for combat, standing their ground because they believed help was coming, even though no one had told them so. Deep beneath the residential dome, in one of the shelter corridors carved into the colony's bedrock, a woman named Lucy Farrow held her 2 young sons close against her sides and hummed a quiet tune to keep them calm. Her husband had left 3 years earlier on a supply run and never returned, lost somewhere in the cold distances between stars, and she had raised her boys alone ever since, teaching them to plant seeds in the valley fields and to name the constellations visible from the colony's northern ridge. Her oldest son, only 7 years old, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes and asked if the bad ships were going to take their home away. She told him no, because she did not know what else a mother could say in that moment, and she prayed silently that she was not lying to him. 31 minutes remained on the clock. Back in the council chamber, Speaker Cadris watched the same broadcast feed with an expression I could only describe as bored, as if this were simply another minor conflict among lesser species, the kind of thing that happened somewhere in the galaxy every single day, and required no real attention from beings as old and as powerful as the council delegates around him. "You seem remarkably calm, Delegate Ellison," he said, turning his reptilian eyes toward me. for someone about to lose an entire colony. I'm not going to lose it, I said. Confidence is admirable, he said. Foolishness less so. I did not answer him. I was watching my private display, where a new signal had just appeared at the edge of the system, faint and barely detectable, moving fast. Solon leaned toward me slightly, his blue skin catching the dim light of the chamber. Grace, he said quietly, using my first name for the first time since I had known him. If there is anything the Vantar delegation can offer, even quietly, even unofficially, I would extend it now. I looked at him, surprised by the sudden kindness after so many months of careful distance between us. Thank you, Solon, I said, but I don't think we need it, not this time. He studied my face for a long moment, clearly trying to understand what had changed in my expression, then sat back in his seat without another word, though his eyes stayed fixed on me rather than on the countdown display above. 26 minutes. On the ground, Daniel Marsh had climbed out from under his workbench and was running system diagnostics on the shield generators with a focus that seemed to steady his shaking hands. Beside him, a younger technician named Grace Whitmore, no relation to me despite the shared name, was monitoring power output levels and calling them out in a voice that cracked less each time she spoke. Shields holding at 94%, she said. If they open fire with everything they have, we won't last more than a few minutes. Then we make those minutes count, Daniel said. He turned to check the secondary power couplings running along the far wall, tightening a loose connector with quick, practiced hands, and for a moment his fear seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by the simple focus of a man doing the only job he knew how to do. Grace Whitmore watched him work and found her own hands steadier for it, the way courage sometimes passes quietly between people without either of them noticing. I found myself admiring them both, two engineers barely out of university, standing at their posts with a fleet of alien warships hanging over their heads, refusing to run. I thought about all the times I had sat in that council chamber and heard humanity described as small, young, unimportant. I thought about how wrong that description had always been, and how badly the galaxy was about to learn it. 19 minutes remained. The signal at the edge of the system grew stronger, and then a second signal appeared beside it, and then a third. I watched the numbers climb on my display, slowly at first, then faster, dozens becoming hundreds within the span of a few short minutes. My hands trembled slightly as I watched the count rise, not from fear this time, but from something closer to awe. Overlord Vorak's fleet had not yet noticed. Their sensors, built to detect threats from species they already knew and understood, were not calibrated for what was approaching. We had spent a decade making sure of that too. I thought back to the briefing rooms on Earth where this plan had first been drawn up, long tables full of engineers and strategists arguing over stealth coatings and sensor masking technology late into the night, all of them driven by the same simple fear, that if the galaxy ever truly knew what humanity could build, someone would try to take it from us before we finished building it. I had thought at the time that such caution bordered on paranoia, watching that signal count climb silently past the edge of a fleet that had no idea it was already outnumbered. I understood it had been nothing of the sort. It had been foresight, earned the hard way, the same way every hard lesson in our history had ever been earned. 14 minutes. Claire Whitfield's voice came through the colony comm again, calm and steady despite everything. All personnel, hold position. Whatever happens next, we hold together. I watched Daniel Marsh glance toward the small window near his workstation, up at the dark shapes of enemy ships still gathered in orbit, waiting for the moment they believed would end everything he had built here. He did not know that somewhere beyond the reach of his own sensors, hundreds of vessels were already closing the distance, moving faster than anything the Dren Ascendancy had ever encountered, running silent and dark exactly as they had been designed to do. 9 minutes. In the chamber, I allowed myself a small breath, the first calm breath I had taken since the alarm first sounded. Speaker Cadris noticed the change in me immediately, his eyes narrowing with something that might have been the beginning of concern. Something has changed, he said. Something has, I agreed. Overlord Vorak's voice returned to the open channel, sharper now, impatient. 5 minutes, Council. Choose your response carefully. History remembers those who stand aside as clearly as it remembers those who fall. 5 minutes remained on my display, and beside that number, another figure continued to climb, faster now, the edge of the system lighting up with signals too numerous for even my own trained eye to count with any real accuracy anymore. I thought of Daniel Marsh and Grace Whitmore standing at their posts below, of Claire Whitfield holding 400 frightened people together through sheer will, of every quiet year Fleet Command had spent preparing for a morning exactly like this one. 3 minutes. I looked up at Speaker Cadris, at Solon, at the rows of delegates who had spent years believing they understood exactly what humanity was, and exactly what we were not. You should watch closely now, I said. This is the part where everything changes. 2 minutes. In the shelter corridor, Lucy Farrow felt her younger son's small hand tighten around her own, and she looked up at the reinforced ceiling above her, imagining the dark ships hanging somewhere beyond it, imagining the valley fields she had planted with her husband years ago, the northern ridge where she had taught her boys the names of stars that now felt closer and more threatening than they ever had before. She did not know about the fleet closing in from the edge of the system. She only knew that she had chosen to stay, and that whatever came next, her sons would remember that she had not run. 1 minute. Overlord Vorak's flagship began to shift position, its forward weapon arrays rotating slowly toward the surface of Haven Ridge, confident and unhurried. The posture of a predator who has never once in its long, violent history been made to feel like prey. In the chamber, I watched the final seconds tick away on the display above the council table, and beside me, Dane Speaker Cadris had gone very still, his earlier boredom replaced by something sharper, something closer to attention. He had noticed, finally, the strange readings gathering at the edge of the system, readings his own advisors could not yet explain. "Delegate Ellison," he said slowly, "what exactly is approaching that colony?" I did not answer him immediately. I was watching the countdown reach its final 10 seconds, watching the signal count at the edge of the system swell into numbers that no longer resembled anything modest, anything the Council would have expected from a species they had spent 3 years calling small. On the ground, Daniel Marsh took a slow breath, placed his hand flat against the humming reactor housing beside him, and waited, the way every one of us across 2 worlds and 1 silent waiting fleet were waiting, for the storm we had spent 10 years building in secret to finally arrive. The sky above Haven Ridge tore open. 1 second, Overlord Vorak's weapon arrays were rotating toward the surface, and the next, space itself seemed to fracture around his fleet, as hundreds of human vessels dropped out of stealth in perfect, silent formation. There was no dramatic flash of light, no warning shot fired across the darkness. One moment the Dren Ascendancy believed it faced an empty sky, and the next it found itself surrounded on every side by ships it had never detected, never counted, and never once imagined could exist. I watched it happen from the council chamber, my private display filling with tactical readouts faster than I could process them. Fleet Commander Oliver Pratt's voice came through my earpiece, calm and clipped, the sound of a man running the most important minutes of his career with complete control. "All formations, hold position. Do not fire first. Let them make the choice." The ships themselves were unlike anything the Council had on record for any species. Long, dark hulls built without a single unnecessary curve, designed purely for efficiency and endurance rather than display, moved into formation with a silence that felt almost unnatural given their size. Each dreadnought carried enough armor plating to withstand sustained bombardment from an entire planetary defense grid, and each one had been built, tested, and stationed without a single leak reaching any Council intelligence network in over a decade of careful, patient work. On the ground, Daniel Marsh stumbled backward from the reactor housing as the entire colony's sensor network lit up at once, alarms shifting from warning tones to something closer to disbelief. Grace Whitmore stared at her console, her mouth open, unable to form words for several long seconds. That's not possible," she finally managed. "Daniel, look at this. Look at how many there are." Above them, Overlord Vorak's flagship rotated hard, its sensors straining to process a battlefield that had changed completely in less than a second. 12 Dren warships, each one a veteran of countless conquered worlds, now found themselves boxed in by a wall of human dreadnoughts, stretching farther than their instruments could measure in any single sweep. "Identify these vessels," Vorak snarled, his voice no longer carrying the same lazy confidence it had held only moments earlier. "Where did they come from? How were we not warned?" His weapons officer, a broad-shouldered Dren soldier named Threx, ran frantic calculations across his console, his claws scraping against the controls. "Overlord, our sensors show. It cannot be accurate. We are reading in excess of 500 vessels within immediate range alone, with more signals still emerging beyond scanning distance. That is a malfunction. Recalibrate." "I have recalibrated 3 times, Overlord. The number does not change." Threx's claws hovered over his console, trembling slightly as he pulled up a secondary scan, hoping for a different result. The numbers only grew larger. He had served aboard Dren warships for over 20 years, had taken part in the conquest of 6 different systems, and had never once seen a sensor grid struggle to process the scale of an approaching force the way his was struggling now. Every instinct trained into him by 2 decades of successful campaigns told him this should not be possible, and yet the evidence continued mounting on his own display, undeniable and growing by the second. In the chamber, Speaker Cadris leaned forward in his seat, his pale green scales catching the light as the main display switched to a live tactical feed, showing the full scale of what had just surrounded Vorak's fleet. I watched his composure crack for the first time since I had known him, his mouth opening slightly, as the number on the screen climbed past what any council record had ever shown for humanity. "That cannot be human," he said quietly. "Your species has 340 ships on record." "We updated the record," I said. "We just never told you when." Around us, the chamber had erupted into overlapping conversations, dozens of delegates speaking at once in a chaos of translated voices, some demanding explanations from their own intelligence officers, others simply staring at the display in silence. The Torvani cluster, who had refused to meet my eyes only an hour earlier, now leaned forward as one, studying the tactical readout with an intensity I had never seen from them before. Even the cheer delegation, usually reserved and quiet, clicked their mandibles rapidly in a display I recognized from our earlier meal together as a sign of genuine alarm. "How long," Cadris asked slowly, "has this fleet existed?" "Longer than you'd be comfortable knowing," I said. "We built it the same way every species in this chamber built its own defenses, quietly, patiently, without asking anyone's permission." Overlord Vorak's flagship broadcast a demand across every open channel, his voice tight with something new, something that had not been present in his earlier threats. "Identify your commander. State your intentions." Oliver Pratt's voice answered, steady and unhurried, carried across the same channel for the entire council chamber to hear. "This is Fleet Commander Oliver Pratt, Earth Defense Force. You issued an ultimatum against a civilian colony. That ultimatum has expired. You are currently surrounded by a force capable of ending this engagement in under 4 minutes. I am offering you the chance to withdraw instead." There was a long pause on the channel. I could almost feel the calculations happening aboard Vorak's flagship, the desperate recounting of odds that had shifted so violently in the span of 60 seconds that no strategy prepared in advance could account for them. "You would not dare fire on us within council jurisdiction," Vorak said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "We're not asking your permission to defend our people," Oliver replied. "We're asking you to leave before we stop asking." Vorak's flagship held its position for several long seconds, its captain clearly weighing options that had all narrowed to the same impossible conclusion. His fleet, once a symbol of dominance across 100 conquered systems, now sat trapped inside a wall of vessels it could not outmaneuver, outgun, or outrun. I imagined the frantic conversations happening aboard that flagship, officers trained their entire lives to expect victory, now forced to reckon with a threat their doctrine had never prepared them to face. On the ground, Lucy Farrow felt the shelter walls tremble faintly, not from an explosion, but from the sheer number of vessels now moving through the upper atmosphere, their engines humming a deep, steady note that seemed to vibrate through the bedrock itself. Her older son looked up at her, his fear replaced suddenly by something like wonder. "Mama, is that us?" he asked. "Are those our ships?" She did not know how to answer him. She had lived her entire life believing humanity possessed nothing more than survey vessels and outdated patrol craft, the same story every colonist had been told for years. Watching the shelter's small viewport fill with the shapes of warships she had never known existed, she felt something complicated rise in her chest, equal parts relief and disbelief. Aboard Vorak's flagship, Threx continued reporting new readings as they appeared, his voice rising with something close to panic. "Overlord, additional formations are still arriving. The count now exceeds 800 vessels, still climbing. Our long-range sensors cannot find the edge of their fleet." "Enough," Vorak snapped. "Bring weapons to full charge. We will not be intimidated by a species that hid its strength like cowards." I felt my stomach tighten when I heard that order relayed across the open channel, and beside me, Solon reached over and gripped my arm gently, his blue skin cool against my own. "Grace," he said quietly, "what happens now?" "Now we find out if he's foolish enough to actually try," I said. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. The entire chamber held its breath, delegates from 40 different worlds leaning forward in their seats, watching a battle unfold that none of them could have predicted even an hour earlier. Then Vorak's flagship opened fire. A single beam of dark energy lanced out from the flagship's forward array, aimed directly at the nearest human dreadnought. I felt my heart stop in that instant, certain I was about to watch the first casualties of a war none of us had chosen. The beam struck a shimmering barrier nearly a kilometer from the Dreadnought's hull and dissolved instantly, absorbed by a shielding technology the Dren Ascendancy had never encountered in any of their conquests. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion could have been. "Shields intact," came a calm voice over the human fleet channel. "No damage sustained. Return fire authorized," Oliver said. "Disable only. No lethal targeting unless directly threatened." What followed was not the massacre Vorak had clearly expected to unleash on Haven Ridge, and it was not the desperate defensive battle he might have expected from a species he still did not fully understand. It was something far more controlled, far more unsettling to watch. Human vessels moved with precise, coordinated discipline, each dreadnought targeting specific systems aboard the Dren ships, weapon arrays, engine cores, shield generators, disabling rather than destroying, closing the trap slowly and deliberately, rather than crushing it all at once. Aboard Vohorak's flagship, Threx's console exploded in a shower of sparks, as a precision strike severed the ship's main weapons relay. "Overlord, we have lost forward armament. Shields at 60% and falling." A second Dren cruiser attempted to break formation and flee toward the outer edge of the system, its engines flaring bright as its captain made a desperate bid for open space. 3 human dreadnoughts shifted position without any visible signal passing between them, moving with the kind of coordination that comes only from years of shared training, and cut off every possible escape vector within seconds. A single disabling strike found the fleeing cruiser's engine core, and it drifted to a slow, powerless stop, its crew left staring out at a wall of vessels they had no way of outrunning. Around the flagship, the same pattern repeated across every vessel in the Dren formation. Engines flickered and died. Weapon systems went dark one by one, each strike so precise that damage reports coming back to the flagship read almost identically across every ship, as though the entire battle had been calculated down to the smallest detail long before the first shot was ever fired. Within 90 seconds, Vorak's entire fleet floated dead in space, stripped of the ability to fight but left fully intact, every crew member aboard still alive, still breathing, still very much aware of exactly how badly they had misjudged the species they came to threaten. In the chamber, the display showed the final tactical readout: 12 Dren warships completely disabled without a single hull breach, without a single confirmed casualty on either side. I heard gasps ripple through the council delegates around me, a sound I had never once heard in 3 years of quiet dismissal and polite condescension. Overlord Vorak's voice returned to the open channel, stripped now of every trace of arrogance it had carried only minutes earlier. "You had the power to destroy us completely," he said slowly, as if forcing the words out against his will. "Why did you not use it?" "Because that was never the point," Oliver answered. "We came to protect a colony, not to start a war we don't need. You're free to leave, Overlord. I'd suggest you take the offer while it's still on the table." Threx, still seated at his ruined console, looked toward his Overlord with an expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "Overlord, our tow systems are still functional. We can accept the offer." Vorak said nothing for a long moment, his claws pressed white against the arm of his command chair. In all his years leading conquests across 100 systems, he had never once been forced to accept mercy from an enemy he had underestimated so completely. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he might choose destruction over the humiliation of retreat. "Power the tow systems," he finally said, his voice hollow. "We are leaving." There was a long silence before Vorak's flagship, along with the rest of his disabled fleet, began drifting slowly away from Haven Ridge under its own limited power, retreating without another word spoken across the channel. On the ground, Daniel Marsh sat down heavily on the floor of the engineering hall, his hands finally steady, his breath coming in short, disbelieving gasps. Beside him, Grace Whitmore laughed, the kind of laughter that comes only after fear has finally released its grip, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. Outside, colonists began emerging cautiously from the shelters, blinking up at a sky that had promised destruction only minutes earlier, and now held nothing but the calm, silent presence of the fleet that had saved them. Some wept openly. Others simply stood still, staring upward, unable to fully process how quickly everything had changed. A few of the younger colonists began cheering, their voices rising into the open air in a wave of relief that spread quickly through the crowd gathered outside the residential domes. In the shelter corridor, Lucy Farrow held her sons close and watched through the small viewport as the massive human fleet remained in orbit, a silent, steady presence, where only minutes earlier there had been nothing but threat and darkness. Her younger son reached up and touched the glass gently. "They came for us," he whispered. "Yes," Lucy said, her own voice breaking slightly. "They did." Around the chamber, delegates continued to murmur among themselves, though the earlier laughter had vanished completely, replaced by something closer to careful reassessment. I noticed several delegations quietly reviewing archived transcripts of every meeting humanity had ever attended, as though searching backward through years of dismissed requests and polite refusals for some sign they had missed, some warning they had failed to take seriously. Solon sat very still beside me, his blue eyes fixed on the tactical display, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual careful diplomacy. "We owe you an apology, Grace," he said quietly. "One this council will need a long time to properly give." "We didn't do this for an apology," I said. "We did it because it was the right thing to do, and because we were finally ready to be believed when we said we could." In the council chamber, I turned slowly to face Speaker Cadris, whose pale green scales had lost some of their earlier color, whose posture had shifted from lazy authority to something far more careful, far more measured. "You said Haven Ridge would be erased," I said quietly. "It wasn't." He did not answer me immediately. Around the chamber, delegates from 40 different worlds were still staring at the tactical display, still trying to process a number that continued climbing even as the immediate crisis resolved, a number that would not stop until it settled on a figure none of them had ever imagined associating with the smallest, youngest species in the entire council. 500,000. I watched the number finally stop climbing on the main display, watched it hang there in silent, undeniable light above a chamber that had spent 3 years laughing at everything my species claimed to be capable of, and for the first time since I had arrived in that room, no one was laughing at all. Somewhere far below, on the surface of a small colony that had nearly been erased for the crime of being defenseless, 400 people stood beneath an open sky and looked up at proof that they had never truly been defenseless at all. And somewhere far above them, 500,000 ships held their quiet formation, not as a warning, not as a threat, but simply as a promise finally kept, a promise made a decade earlier by people who had decided that patience, discipline, and careful preparation could accomplish what fear and aggression never could. I did not know yet what this moment would mean for humanity's place among the stars, whether it would bring us respect or simply a different, more careful kind of fear. But standing there in that silent chamber, watching delegates who had once laughed openly now sit in stunned, careful silence, I understood that whatever came next, the galaxy would never again make the mistake of assuming it understood exactly what my species was capable of. Speaker Cadris called an emergency session before the dust of the battle had even settled, and this time, no one in the chamber was laughing. I stood at the same podium where I had spent 3 years being politely dismissed, except now every delegate in the room was leaning forward, watching me with an attention I had never once received in this chamber before. The tactical display still hung above the council table, showing the disabled Dren fleet retreating slowly beyond the edge of Haven Ridge, and beside it, the number that had silenced an entire room of ancient, powerful species, 500,000. "Delegate Ellison," Cadris said, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension, "the council requests a full accounting of this fleet, its size, its capabilities, the circumstances of its construction." The chamber itself looked different to me now, though nothing about it had physically changed. The same high ceilings arched overhead carved with symbols from a dozen founding species, the same long table curved around the central floor, seating delegates in the same order they had occupied for years. But the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where once I had felt like an intruder standing at a podium reserved for the smallest voice in the room, I now felt every delegate's attention pressing against me with a weight that was almost physical. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head over the years, imagining what I would say if this day ever came. Standing there now, with the real thing finally in front of me, I found the words came easier than I expected. "I can tell you what you need to know," I said, "but I want to be honest with you first about why we never told you sooner." A murmur passed through the chamber, quieter this time, more careful. I noticed several delegates exchanging glances, the kind of look shared between people who suspect they are about to hear something uncomfortable. "When my species first joined this council," I said, "we studied your history very carefully. We learned that nearly every conflict recorded here began the same way. One side discovered exactly how strong or how weak another side truly was, and that knowledge either invited aggression or invited exploitation. We watched species after species get pulled into wars simply because someone finally counted their ships and decided the numbers looked favorable. Cadre said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed slightly, the way they did when he was listening more carefully than he wanted to show. So we made a decision, I continued. We would never let anyone count us until the moment counting no longer mattered. Not because we wanted power over anyone in this chamber, but because we had already lived through enough conflict of our own, back on Earth, long before we ever reached the stars. We know exactly what happens when the strong believe the weak have nothing to offer but submission. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Our own history is full of moments where nations grew powerful simply because their neighbors underestimated them, and full of moments where entire peoples suffered because someone else decided their strength no longer mattered enough to respect. We did not want to repeat either mistake out here among the stars, so we chose patience instead. We chose to build quietly, to train quietly, to grow quietly, until the day came when quiet was no longer the safest choice available to us. And so you built 500,000 warships in secret, said a new voice, sharp and skeptical, belonging to a delegate I recognized as representing the Torvani cluster. Forgive me, Delegate Ellison, but that sounds less like caution and more like preparation for conquest. I had expected this question, and I answered it without hesitation. If we wanted conquest, Overlord Verhorak's entire fleet would be debris right now instead of drifting home intact. We disabled 12 warships without killing a single crew member aboard them. That was not an accident, that was the entire point. The Torvani delegate did not respond immediately, though I noticed several of his colleagues nodding slowly, weighing the truth of what I had just said against the evidence they had all just watched unfold in real time. Your species disabled 12 warships belonging to a hostile power in under 2 minutes, he finally said. And yet you speak of restraint as though it cost you nothing. I find that difficult to reconcile. It cost us plenty, I said. It cost a decade of resources that could have gone toward 100 other things. It cost every family on Haven Ridge an afternoon of pure terror they'll carry with them for years. Restraint isn't the same as ease. We chose the harder path today because it was the right one, not because it was simple. He studied me for a long moment, his multiple eyes blinking in a pattern I still could not fully interpret after 3 years of council sessions, then inclined his head slightly. A gesture I had learned was the closest thing his species offered to genuine respect. Solon rose from his seat near the front of the chamber, something he rarely did during formal sessions. I can confirm the tactical logs support the delegate's account, he said. Every strike was calculated for disablement, not destruction. In 20 years serving this council, I have never seen restraint of that precision from any species, including my own. I felt a small measure of gratitude toward him for saying it, though I kept my expression steady, aware that the chamber was still watching my every reaction. Cadris leaned forward, his pale green scales catching the light of the display above him. 500,000 vessels represents a force greater than the combined defense fleets of every council member species, he said slowly. Why reveal this number now, rather than continuing to conceal it? Because concealment stopped serving its purpose the moment Overlord Vorak threatened 400 innocent people, I said. We built that fleet to protect what matters to us. Today, we used it exactly the way it was intended to be used. I have no interest in hiding that from you any longer. And if this council had chosen to intervene on your behalf earlier today, Cadris said, as you originally requested, would this number have remained hidden? I considered the question carefully before answering. Possibly, but I doubt it would have stayed hidden forever. Secrets that size have a way of finding daylight eventually, one way or another. I would rather it happened this way, with proof of restraint, than through some accident that left the galaxy guessing at our intentions. A long silence settled over the chamber. I watched delegates from 40 different worlds processing what they had just heard, some with expressions of careful calculation, others with something closer to unease. I understood that unease. For years, this council had operated under the comfortable assumption that they understood exactly where every species stood in the galaxy's rough hierarchy of power. That comfortable assumption had just been shattered in the span of a single afternoon. There will need to be a formal review, Cadris said finally. This council cannot simply accept the sudden existence of a fleet this size without proper documentation, verification, and discussion among the full membership. I expected nothing less, I said. We're prepared to cooperate fully. We're not asking this council to simply take our word for it. We're asking you to judge us by what you already witnessed today. Another delegate spoke up, this one from a small aquatic species I had rarely heard address the full chamber before. Her voice, translated through a device attached to her breathing apparatus, came out soft and careful. Delegate Ellison, may I ask something more personal? Were you afraid, standing here today, not knowing whether help would arrive in time? The question caught me off guard, coming as it did after so many pointed, strategic inquiries from the larger delegations. I thought about it honestly before answering. Yes, I said. I was terrified. I had 400 people counting on a plan I wasn't allowed to fully understand myself, and for most of that hour, I had no idea whether it would actually work. Fear didn't disappear just because I trusted the people executing that plan. It just became something I had to carry quietly while I did my job. The aquatic delegate nodded slowly, something like sympathy passing across her expression, and I found myself grateful that at least one voice in that chamber had thought to ask about the human cost of the day, rather than only the tactical implications. Cadrus studied me for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier formality. 3 years ago, Delegate Ellison, I told you that observers watch and do not demand. I believe I owe you a correction to that statement. You did not simply demand today, he continued. You protected. There is a difference this council has perhaps been too slow to recognize. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, allowing the moment to settle rather than filling it with words that might have diminished its weight. This session will reconvene in 1 week, Cadrus announced to the full chamber, at which time this council will formally discuss humanity's status among our membership. Until then, I would ask every delegation present to consider carefully what they witnessed today, and what it means for how this council conducts itself going forward. As the chamber began to empty, delegates filing out in small clusters, murmuring quietly among themselves, Solon approached me at the podium, his expression softer than I had seen it in the 3 years I had known him. You held yourself together remarkably well today, he said. I had a lot of practice hiding fear in front of this chamber, I said. 3 years of it, actually. He almost smiled at that, a rare expression from someone usually so carefully composed. For what it's worth, Grace, I never laughed. Not once, not even quietly. I simply never had the courage to say so out loud. That means more than you probably realize, I said. There is something else I should tell you, Solon added, glancing briefly toward the emptying chamber before lowering his voice. The Vantar delegation will support your bid for full membership when the vote comes. I cannot promise the same for every delegation here, but you will not stand alone next week. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still tight. 3 years of careful, patient diplomacy, and this was the first unqualified promise of support I had received from anyone in that chamber. Thank you, Solon. That matters more than any fleet number could. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect the fleet number will do most of the persuading on its own. I looked back at the now empty tactical display, at the space where the number 500,000 had hung only a short while earlier, silent and undeniable, and I thought about Daniel Marsh sitting on the floor of his engineering hall, about Lucy Farrow holding her sons close in a shelter that had never needed to be a shelter, about Oliver Pratt's calm voice cutting through the chaos exactly when it mattered most. I gathered my notes from the podium slowly, aware of a few remaining delegates still watching me from across the emptying chamber, their expressions no longer carrying the polite dismissal I had grown so used to over the years. Some looked curious, some looked cautious. A few, I noticed, looked almost hopeful, as though the events of the day had opened a door they had quietly wished for without ever expecting it to actually open. Walking out of the chamber that evening, I passed the same long corridor I had walked 1,000 times before, lined with portraits and monuments honoring species who had shaped this council over thousands of years. For the first time, I found myself wondering what a human monument might eventually look like among them. Not a monument to conquest or dominance, but perhaps something quieter, something that spoke instead to patience, restraint, and the simple, stubborn refusal to let fear decide who we would become. We had spent a decade preparing for a single morning we hoped would never come. Now that it had, I understood that everything about our place in this galaxy was about to change, and for the first time since I had arrived in that chamber, I found myself looking forward to finding out exactly how. 1 week later, I stood at the same podium for what felt like the 100th time, except this time my hands were not shaking, and this time, every single delegate in the chamber had arrived early, none of them willing to miss the vote that would decide humanity's future among the stars. Speaker Cadrus opened the session without his usual formal preamble, moving directly to the matter at hand. This council will now vote on the formal admission of humanity as a full member species, with complete voting rights and standing equal to any delegation present. The week between the battle and this vote had passed in a blur of meetings, reviews, and careful negotiations. Fleet Command had opened select portions of our defense records to council inspectors, enough to verify our claims without exposing every detail of our capabilities. And I had spent long hours answering questions from delegations who wanted to understand not just what we had built, but why we had chosen the particular philosophy guiding its use. Some conversations had been tense. Others had surprised me with their warmth. Delegates who had barely spoken to me in 3 years, suddenly eager to understand how a species so young had developed such careful, deliberate restraint. I watched the vote tally begin to climb on the display above the table, delegation after delegation registering their support, some with visible enthusiasm, others with the careful, measured approval of species who had spent the last week reviewing every scrap of evidence Fleet Command had provided them. Solin's vote registered early, exactly as he had promised. The aquatic delegate who had asked me about fear also voted in favor, followed quickly by the cheer delegation, whose forelimbs clicked rapidly in what I now understood, after a week of careful study, to be a gesture of genuine approval rather than alarm. The final tally appeared moments later. Unanimous. I had imagined this moment for 3 years, and somehow the reality of it felt quieter than I had expected, less like triumph and more like a long exhale after holding my breath for far too long. Delegate Ellison, Cadris said, the Council also wishes to extend an additional offer. Given the demonstrated capability of your defense forces, humanity is invited to accept a permanent seat on the Council's Security Committee, with authority equal to the eldest founding species. A murmur passed through the chamber, not the dismissive murmur I had grown used to over the years, but something closer to genuine anticipation, delegates waiting to see how I would respond to an offer that some species had spent centuries trying to earn. I thought about that offer carefully before answering, because I had actually discussed this exact possibility with Fleet Command, and with the Earth Council back home during the past week. Long conversations that stretched late into the night, as we weighed what kind of galaxy we actually wanted to help build. I want to thank the Council for that offer, I said, but I need to decline it, at least for now. The chamber went quiet, and I saw genuine surprise flicker across several delegates' faces, including Cadris himself. May I ask why, he said. Few species in this council's history have ever refused a security committee seat. Because power like that changes how everyone around you behaves, whether you want it to or not, I said. We spent a decade building strength, specifically so we would never have to depend on fear to keep our people safe. If we accepted a permanent seat of authority over every other species in this chamber, we would become exactly the kind of power we built our entire defense strategy to avoid becoming. I paused, looking around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of delegates who had spent 3 years treating my presence as a formality, rather than a voice worth hearing. What we want instead, I continued, is simply what we asked for from the very beginning. A seat at this table as equals, not enforcers, not protectors standing above everyone else. Just partners, working alongside every species here, the same way Fleet Commander Pratt worked alongside Haven Ridge last week, present when needed, but never demanding control in exchange for that presence. Cadris studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, an emotion I had never seen from him before in 3 years of formal sessions. It looked almost like genuine respect. A delegate from a species I had rarely heard speak in formal session, representing a small farming world near the council's outer boundary, raised a hand slowly and asked to be recognized. Delegate Ellison, if I may. Many smaller species in this chamber have long feared that any sufficiently powerful newcomer would eventually seek to reshape this council in their own image. Your answer today addresses that fear more thoroughly than any treaty could. That fear is exactly why we answered the way we did, I said. We know what it feels like to sit at the edge of a room, wondering if the people with power will remember you exist once decisions actually get made. We have no intention of making anyone else in this chamber feel that way. That is a wiser answer than most species could offer, Cadris said quietly. Very well. Humanity's seat will remain equal to every delegation present, full voting rights, full standing, without additional authority beyond what any member species holds. The chamber erupted into a rare moment of open applause, dozens of species expressing approval in whatever manner their physiology allowed, a strange and beautiful chorus of alien sounds that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. After the session formally closed, I found myself standing in the same garden where I had once walked with Solon months earlier, back when he still questioned whether I was telling him the truth about our fleet numbers. The garden looked the same as it always had, filled with strange, beautiful plants gathered from a dozen different worlds, their colors blending together in ways that should not have worked but somehow did. Solon joined me there a few minutes later, his expression relaxed in a way I had rarely seen from him during official hours. You surprised the entire chamber today, he said, turning down a security committee seat. I do not believe anyone expected that. I think that's exactly why it needed to happen, I said. Everyone expected us to take the power once we finally had the chance. Maybe showing restraint mattered more than showing strength ever did. He nodded slowly, considering that. My people spent centuries believing that authority and safety were the same thing. Perhaps your species understands something we forgot a long time ago. We walked together in silence for a while, past a cluster of tall silver flowers native to a world I had never visited, their petals opening and closing gently in rhythm with some unseen breeze inside the enclosed garden dome. I thought about how strange it was to feel this calm after a week that had held so much fear, so much uncertainty, so many careful conversations weighing the future of an entire species against the comfort of continued secrecy. "Can I ask you something personal, Solon?" I said eventually. "Of course. When you first met me, 3 years ago, what did you actually think of humanity? Before any of this happened?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I thought you were curious," he said. "Eager, in a way most young species are not, to understand how this council functioned, rather than simply demanding a place within it. I did not think you were weak. I simply assumed, as most delegations did, that your caution meant you had little to offer beyond curiosity. I was wrong about the second part. I was never wrong about the first." I smiled at that, grateful for a friendship that had somehow survived 3 years of careful distance and now felt, for the first time, like something genuine. I smiled at that, though my thoughts had already drifted elsewhere, back to Haven Ridge, back to Daniel Marsh and Grace Whitmore returning to their normal engineering duties, back to Lucy Farrow tucking her sons into bed each night beneath a sky that no longer felt threatening. I had received a message from Claire Whitfield earlier that morning, short and simple, thanking me for whatever part I had played in keeping her colony safe. I had written back telling her the truth, that the real thanks belonged to Oliver Pratt and the thousands of crew members who had spent a decade preparing quietly for a single morning none of us had ever wanted to arrive. Later that same day, I reviewed a longer message Claire Whitfield had sent from Haven Ridge, this one accompanied by a short video clip. It showed the colony's valley fields under a calm afternoon sky, workers returning to the crops they had abandoned during the crisis, children running freely between the water reclamation towers without a trace of the fear that had gripped them only a week earlier. Near the end of the clip, Daniel Marsh appeared briefly, waving awkwardly at the camera before laughing and walking off toward the engineering hall, looking lighter than I had seen him in the footage from that terrible morning. Lucy Farrow's younger son also appeared, pointing excitedly up at the sky, where a small formation of human patrol craft now maintained a quiet, reassuring presence in permanent orbit above the colony. Watching that footage, I felt something settle in my chest that had been tense for longer than I realized, perhaps for the entire 3 years I had spent in that chamber, always half-braced for a crisis I could not fully predict. Seeing Haven Ridge return to something like ordinary life reminded me exactly why every quiet year of preparation had mattered. That evening, back in my private quarters within the council complex, I opened a recorded message from Oliver himself, sent just after the formal vote had concluded. "Congratulations, delegate," his voice said, warm despite the formal title. "For what it's worth, Grace, I always knew you'd get us here eventually. Just took the rest of the galaxy a little longer to catch up." I sat quietly for a while after that message ended, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about my grandmother, long past now, who used to tell me stories about a different kind of tension back on Earth, decades before I was born, when nations held enough destructive power to end the world several times over and somehow, through nothing but careful restraint and quiet negotiation, managed to avoid using any of it. She used to say that true strength was never about how much damage you could cause, it was about how much damage you chose not to cause, even when you had every justification to unleash it. I understood now, sitting in that quiet room with the weight of the day finally settling around me, that humanity had not actually escaped that lesson when we left Earth behind. We had simply carried it with us, scaled it up to a size the entire galaxy could finally see, and used it exactly the way my grandmother always said it should be used, not as a threat, but as a promise kept quietly, until the moment it mattered most. A few days later, I received an unexpected visitor at my office within the council complex. Speaker Cadris himself, arriving without any of his usual formal escort, stepped through my door and studied the small human decorations I had gathered over 3 years of service, photographs of Earth, a small potted plant from my childhood garden, a simple wooden carving my father had made before I left for this posting. "I wanted to speak with you privately," he said, away from the formality of the chamber. "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk. He remained standing instead, his posture unusually careful. "I owe you a more complete apology than the one I offered publicly," he said. "For 3 years, I dismissed your species as insignificant, not because of any real evidence, but because it was simply easier to categorize you that way. I allowed old assumptions to replace genuine curiosity, and that failure belongs entirely to me." I considered his words carefully before responding. "I appreciate that, Speaker Cadris, but I don't think this council's mistake was really about us specifically. I think it's a mistake this council has probably made about a lot of species over the centuries, assuming that quiet meant weak, that patience meant fear, that anyone who did not demand attention simply had nothing worth paying attention to." He was quiet for a moment, considering that. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this council has grown too comfortable, assuming it already understands everyone within it. Then maybe that's the real lesson worth carrying forward," I said. "Not just about humanity, but about every quiet species in this chamber who might be building something the rest of you have never bothered to notice." He nodded slowly, something that looked almost like genuine humility crossing his ancient, weathered features. "I will carry that thought with me, Delegate Ellison." "Thank you." Before leaving, Cadris paused at my door and turned back toward me once more. "May I ask you one final question, Delegate Ellison, purely out of personal curiosity rather than official duty?" "Of course." "The number your fleet chose to reveal, 500,000. Was that truly the full extent of your strength, or simply the portion you judged necessary to show us?" I considered how to answer honestly without revealing more than I should. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Speaker Cadris." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his ancient eyes, and then, to my surprise, he allowed himself something close to a smile. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believe I do." Then he turned and left without another word, his footsteps fading slowly down the corridor outside my office. After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long while, looking out through the window at the distant lights of 1,000 alien vessels moving quietly through council space, each one representing a species with its own history, its own fears, its own quiet strengths that the rest of the galaxy had perhaps never fully appreciated either. I thought about the countdown clock from that first terrifying hour, about Daniel Marsh's shaking hands steadying over his console, about Lucy Farrow humming softly to calm her frightened sons, about Oliver Pratt's calm, steady voice cutting through chaos exactly when it mattered most. I thought about every quiet year humanity had spent preparing for a moment we hoped would never come, and how strange it felt now that the moment had finally passed, replaced by something calmer, something closer to genuine hope for what might come next. The galaxy had spent 3 years underestimating us, mistaking our patience for weakness, our silence for insignificance. We had never needed to prove them wrong through conquest or domination. We simply needed one single morning where the truth could no longer be ignored, one moment where restraint and strength stood together instead of against each other, and a number large enough that no one in that chamber would ever again mistake quiet for weak. 500,000 ships had done more than save a single colony that day. They had rewritten every assumption an ancient, powerful council had ever made about the newest, youngest species sitting quietly at their table. And as I sat there in the settling darkness of my office, watching those distant lights drift peacefully across the stars, I found myself thinking not about the fear of that terrible countdown, but about everything still waiting to be built now that the galaxy had finally learned to listen.